Let us now look at the West, covert chemical sterilization. The low fertility levels found in the developed world and their falling populations are conveniently attributed to the effects of affluence to mask the true source, namely the chronic poisoning of the masses via chemical agents delivered through the basic elements of life: water, food, cosmetic and consumer products. If affluence were indeed the reason for falling fertility rates, then the oil-rich countries of the Gulf would have the lowest number of children. But that is not the case, as women in wealthy countries such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates continue to have unchanged reproductive rates at around 4 to 6 children per woman until 1990, when they began introducing fluoride and BPA in their people's water and food, along with dozens of other endocrine disruptors. Since 1960, the 28 member states of the European Union have grown from 420 to 500 million, a paltry 16% increase, while countries in the developing world grew 300% and thus tripled their population during the same time. According to Eurostat, the total population of the EU will continue to increase at a reduced pace until 2025, due solely to migration, and then begin a steady decline. Without migration, the EU's population would have started a rapid decline in 2010. The birth of approximately 300 million Europeans has been prevented by the global depopulation policy. The entire European continent, including Russia, has entered the last stage of the demographic transition, the shrinking stage. And this shows that the covert chemical sterilization methods chosen by Western nations, in conjunction with a variety of psychosocial methods, have been extraordinarily effective in halting population growth. In fact, they have been so effective that many EU nations have had to introduce economic incentives to boost births in order to prevent a population decline that is too rapid and could spell their economic collapse. Russia's demographic transition is even more advanced than that of Europe. Its population reached a historic peak in 1991 at 149 million, then declined at a rate of 0.5% until 2009, down to 143 million, and has been growing modestly since. The high death rate due to rampant alcoholism and low birth rate due to covert chemical sterilization measures and tough economic conditions account for the drastic fall. The Russian government, having been poisoning its people for the past 60 years in order to lower their fertility, now has to encourage more births to prevent a population collapse. Russia's TFR has climbed to 1.7 children per woman from a low of 1.15 that was reached in 1999, and is now higher than any other European country, Eastern European country. Russia had a population of 120 million in 1960 and 102 million in 1950. That means that its population has increased by a paltry 16% since 1960 and by only 23% since 1950. Russia, therefore, records one of the smallest population increases in the world since World War II. And this is the result of the aggressive and callous way in which the Soviet and later the Russian government has combated population growth. Japan is at an even more advanced stage in its demographic transition than Europe. In 1945, when the Allies started their occupation and began controlling the growth of the Japanese population through chemical means, Japan had 72 million people. By 1960, when it already reached replacement level fertility, Japan had grown to 95 million. Its population peaked at 128 million in 2010 and has been decreasing ever since. That means that Japan has grown only 44% since the end of World War II, when the Allies imposed population control, and by a paltry 25% since 1960. Its population is expected to decline by nearly 1 million people per year in the coming decades and settle at 85 million by 2060, by which time more than 40% of the population will be over the age of 65. The birth of approximately 100 million Japanese has so far been prevented by the global depopulation policy. As the first country in the world to be subjected to chemical sterilization, Japan was also the first to reach replacement level fertility and the first to have more elderly than young people. 40 years from now, Japan will have an inverted population pyramid, and its numbers will have been greatly reduced, just as it was intended by the architects of the global depopulation policy. The United States is a high immigration country, which is why its total fertility rate has not declined as quickly as Europe's, Japan's, or Russia's, despite equal efforts. The TFR for white Americans stands at 1.95, for blacks at 1.96, and for Hispanics at 2.4. At 317 million, the US is the third most populous country in the world. Since 1960, its population has grown by 138 million, or 77%, a far cry from the tripling of the population experienced elsewhere. While its population is still growing due to immigration, the total number of births has been declining since 2007, when it reached an all-time high of 4.3 million. The most optimistic projection shows that the US population will peak in 2040 at around 360 million inhabitants. Clearly, the West's covert chemical sterilization has worked extremely well at halting the population growth. But at what cost? The evidence shows that poisoning the people to lower fertility has terrible consequences. First, it downgrades the genetic and intellectual endowment of humanity. Ample medical and statistical data show that long-term, low-intensity fluoride poisoning lowers intelligence and irreversibly damages genes. The negative effects are cumulative if the poisoning continues over generations, as has been the case in Europe, Russia, Japan, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, and Singapore, basically all of the developed world, who have intentionally subjected their people to fluoride poisoning since circa 1950, to BPA poisoning since 1980, and to aluminum poisoning since 1995, in addition to dozens of other endocrine disruptors added along the years. It is estimated that 5 IQ points are lost by each generation of children subjected, for instance, to fluoride in the womb and during the first years of life. Research also shows that BPA and aluminum, like fluoride, are endocrine disruptors and therefore damage the human body universally and at the molecular level. The benefits of natural selection acquired over millennia of evolution are being reversed by reckless human intervention over a period of decades to accomplish the goals of the global depopulation policy by covert, toxic means, rather than proceeding as China has done by overt legislative means. Secondly, it causes unnecessary illness and suffering. Since all chemical agents chosen to undermine human fertility work by damaging the endocrine system, the unintended side effects to human health are legion. By disrupting the endocrine system, depopulation poisons have an adverse effect on every part and function of the human body, impairing reproduction and development, the immune system and the nervous system. Illnesses associated with Western living standards, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and cancer, conveniently attributed to poor diet and lack of physical activity, are in fact for the most part the result of the endocrine disrupting poisons deliberately fed to people in the developing world since 1950. As the architects of the global depopulation policy have widened the use of these poisons to the developing world, the same illnesses are beginning to wreak havoc there. These so-called illnesses of affluence are in fact the effects of chronic poisoning, and the epidemic is spreading to the developing world far in advance of the affluence that supposedly brought this curse upon the developed world. In countries like Brazil and Iran, for instance, where fluoridation and BPA use have been introduced fast and furious, and not as gradually as in the developed world, these so-called Western ailments are more deadly there than in the West. The World Health Organization, which is central to the global depopulation policy, predicts even more deaths in the future due to chronic illnesses, knowing full well what to expect once their poisons of choice are unleashed upon virgin populations. A second branch of illnesses caused or exacerbated by chemical sterilization agents are neurological and span the entire spectrum of developmental and mental disorders: learning disabilities, speech and language impairments, mental retardation, autism, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, Alzheimer's, Down syndrome, dementia, chronic fatigue syndrome, dyslexia, epilepsy, motor skill disorders, Parkinson's disease, Tourette syndrome, antisocial behavior, schizophrenia, and countless other ailments. More than 25%, that's a quarter of the populations exposed to chemical sterilization agents, are affected by mental or developmental disorders. A tenfold greater incidence than in populations that have not been chronically exposed to such toxic agents. A third group of illnesses concern sex hormone disorders, disorders of sex development, acquired sex disorders, disorders of gender, disorders of puberty, and menstrual function and fertility disorders. Of these, by far the most concerning are gender identity issues, which is why the incidence of LGBT, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, is at least 3 times higher in countries that have chemically poisoned their people to lower their fertility than in countries that have not. A fourth group of illnesses concern the damage done to the immune system, which is rendered either hyperactive or repressed, resulting in either autoimmune diseases and allergies, or respectively in viral attacks and cancers. In one way or another, everyone who is subjected to the poisons of the global depopulation policy suffers from the damage done to the immune system. The overall effect of the West's chemical sterilization program will not be known until research is allowed to occur and scientists are not punished for publishing anything related to the pervasive chemical agents we are intentionally being subjected to for the sake of population control. What is certain is that the general health of people in the developed world is inferior to that of people in the developing world, despite the huge gap in the quality of their healthcare. And that can only be adequately explained by the toxic substances that people in developed nations have been chronically subjected to for the past 60 years. Induced state of bovine obedience is another consequence. Sodium fluoride, for instance, which is the fluoridated compound, one of the fluoridating compounds used and used most often, as it is a byproduct of the aluminum and phosphate industries, is known as the obedience drug, and anyone poisoned with it experiences fluoride fatigue and lives in a state of behavioral control. A fluoridated population is an easily managed, obedient population whose ability to think and act is greatly impaired by the tranquilizing effect of sodium fluoride. But since everyone is being poisoned in the womb, no one knows the difference. The stability of the political system of the Western world has little to do with people's level of satisfaction with the status quo, and everything to do with the fact that Westerners are involuntarily controlled by fluoride poisoning by their eugenic governments. The same is true of the former Eastern Bloc countries, which is why the insufferable conditions of communism were tolerated with little or no dissent, and political change had to wait for the system's economic collapse. Another consequence is that these chemical poisoning methods lead to genetic impoverishment. A well-guarded and revealing statistic is the percentage of women who remain childless in developed countries versus developing countries. It is no coincidence that 1 in 4 women in many European countries, such as Italy and Switzerland, and 1 in 5 women in Canada and the US and elsewhere in the West never have children, whereas 1 in 20 women in China and a mere 1 in 30 in India remain without child. The West's covert chemical sterilization methods, in other words, remove up to a quarter of the populace from the procreation cycle. And this results in a dangerous genetic impoverishment if continued for even 2 or 3 generations. The total fertility rate of developed nations hide the fact that a significant and growing percentage of women have no children whatsoever because their family tree has been pruned by chemical poisoning. Even a conservative estimate reveals that at least 300 million genetic lineages have been stopped dead by the global depopulation policy in the Western world alone. This frightening statistic makes the Nazis, who killed at most 20 million people, look like amateurs compared with the depopulationists that followed suit. These methods also annihilate democracy. The primary duty of democratically elected governments is to ensure their people's security. Poisoning the masses in secret with toxic chemicals to lower their fertility and weaken their immunity goes against fundamental moral tenets and violates the premise that the government respects the will of the people. The people have never given their government or the UN the consent to turn the basic elements of life into weapons of mass sterility and morbidity. Authority that is not rooted in the people and considerate of the fundamental rights of citizens ceases to be legitimate. Since legality is the basis for legitimacy and poisoning people is clearly outside the law, Western governments since 1950 have been illegitimate and to this day remain illegitimate. It subverts the rule of law. No government that has used or is using covert chemical sterilization agents on their people can claim to respect the rule of law, since interfering with people's fertility is a violation of the Genocide Convention, which states unequivocally that, and I quote, "Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As such, A, killing members of the family of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group." All of these sections of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention are being violated by the depopulation policy. Because the entire developed world has been committing genocide for decades, no government can claim to be legal and therefore legitimate. They merely preserve the illusion of legality when in fact governments that commit genocide and crimes against humanity, and have done so for more than 60 years, operate entirely above and outside the law, as no criminal code, constitution, or legal covenant, be it national or international, even remotely attempts to justify the poisoning of people. It also causes irreversible social division. By necessity, the global depopulation policy is driven by a limited number of people who are in the know, while the rest of the population is utterly ignorant. This splits society into insiders who are an empowered elite and outsiders who are innocent victims. More than this, due to the damage chemical sterilization does to the intellectual and genetic endowment of the race, the insiders who know how to protect themselves and their offspring will in just a few generations be genetically and intellectually superior to the general population, who is subjected to chronic and inescapable poisoning. The global depopulation policy, therefore, makes eugenic claims of genetic and intellectual superiority a self-fulfilling prophecy. These methods also demand a culture of secrecy, deception, and cruelty. The architects of the global depopulation policy know that pursuing covert chemical sterilization is a hard sell, and that no one in their right mind could be persuaded to voluntarily subject himself or his children to chronic poisoning regardless of the greater good. That is why they have proceeded in secret by deceiving the general public with lies and dissimulation, so as to be able to cruelly poison their fellow man and damage generations of children in such fundamental ways as to rob them not only of their health and future, but also of their quality of life and dignity. All Western nations are, as a result, sustained by a culture of secrecy and by universal hypocrisy, that, if unveiled, would cause their sudden and well-deserved collapse. The media, the scientific, the political, the military, and even the religious elites are part and parcel of the deception and equally complicit in crimes against humanity. The only way they could have implemented such a global policy by such murderous means is by consenting to cooperate and by agreeing to preserve the veil of secrecy at all costs, lest they should all be called to account for their crimes. Once they have agreed upon this course of action, they knew there would be no way back and no way out. Which is why every Bilderberg meeting, international meeting at Davos, and any of the many Rockefeller foundations, or at the executive level of every UN organization involved, happen behind closed doors. Another consequence is that it brings about the devolution of man. The multi-generational effort demanded by the demographic objectives of the global depopulation policy means that people's intellectual and genetic endowments will be subverted and downgraded for several generations. The damage done and yet to be done reverses nature's work and brings about the devolution of man. The damaged offspring of damaged parents, who themselves are born of damaged parents, will have suffered such degradation that they are unable to cope with the demands of society, which is why we see a growing class of dysfunctional, demoralized, and disabled people in developing countries that have entered the last phase of their demographic transition. This policy and this methodology endangers the ecosystem as well. Chemical sterilization poisons not only the people but also the environment, and leads to environmental degradation at a time when the world can least afford it. Fluoride, for instance, which is a highly toxic element, especially when derived from heavy industry as a byproduct laced with other lethal poisons, is the last thing we should be adding to our drinking water. If it is in our drinking water, it will make its way into our aquifers, lakes, rivers, and creeks, and will in time make all water undrinkable. Our landfills are drowning in non-biodegradable BPA plastics when we could be using clean glass that can be reused again and again, as was done until the 1980s, and that can be easily recycled. And spraying aerosolized aluminum laced with ethylene dibromide, barium, and cationic polymer fibers from the air is nothing short of insane, considering the devastating effect these elements have on us and on all plant and animal life. Add these effects of dozens of plasticides, insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides, and what we have is poisoned soil and water on a global scale. This policy and methodology also misuses science and censors research. The application of science and medicine to cause intentional damage to the human reproductive and immune systems, and unintentional damage to our general health and to our precious intellectual and genetic inheritance, irrevocably undermines our trust in the people and institutions that are charged with protecting us, but that instead severely harm us. If everyone were to misuse their professional credentials the same way as the lawyers, doctors, scientists, and politicians on the payroll of the global depopulation policy are doing, in order to also contribute to the effort to reduce the population, then architects would design every fourth home to collapse on top of its inhabitants. Engineers would build bridges and tunnels with deadly traps. Teachers would encourage their students to bash each other's heads in. Automakers would make sure that the wheels on their cars fall off regularly to cause fatalities. And janitors would apply slippery oils to their newly swept floors to make sure that a sufficient number of people break their necks on any given day. Knowledge is supposed to be used to make our lives better and safer, not deprive us and our children, deprive us of our children, and to make us ill, stupid, and fat. The level of control, manipulation, and repression necessary to steer scientists away from doing vital research and from telling the truth invalidates the entire purpose of scientific research and corrupts entire fields of knowledge, thus undermining the people's trust in science and technology. Last but not least, this methodology invites conflict and mistrust within and between nations. If we cannot trust our doctors and scientists, our generals and politicians, our judges and archbishops, then who can we trust? And why should we tolerate being treated like an infestation and exterminated like vermin? This is the ultimate betrayal of our trust by the very people we need to trust most. No society can or should function as such a morally reprehensible level. That it has come to this speaks volumes about the decadence of Western society, which is where this diabolical policy has originated, and about the perversion of Westerners, who are the architects of this murderous plan. Once people open their eyes and realize what is happening, there will be hell to pay, as we will have to start from the very beginning and replace all our institutions and people who are now in control of the system. There will be no trust left within or between nations, and no one to trust.